Well, Phil, that was John Prendergast. Yeah, very
Yes, it
interesting
was.
fellow, psychotherapist, and also somebody into spirituality in a big way, and combines that with his psychotherapy. I have a question, and you can elaborate on this. I think amongst all contemporary spirituality movements and groups, the one that I have a little bit of difficulty understanding is those involved in self-inquiry, the self-inquiry groups that
Yeah,
are associated with what would be called awakening. What are your thoughts on that? You've looked into that more than I have.
yeah. I actually had a whole section on it in American Veda. There's a group of teachers who are essentially Advaita Vedanta teachers. And Advaita means not two, and
Not two as in the number two, but
yeah.
one.
So all is it's a oneness perspective
Okay.
where everything is Brahman, everything is unity, which in the kind of training you and I had would be a true statement, but one that would depend on the person's state of consciousness. And so the non-dual. I wouldn't call it a movement, but there's a big emphasis on non-duality in certain spiritual circles, and a bunch of teachers, many of whom identify with Ramana Maharshi, the great saint of India, and who had teachers that were not. Ramana didn't really have a lineage, but there were teachers who were influenced by him, studied with him, and who kept teaching. And one in particular, who's called Papaji, his last name was Punja. A lot of people, Americans, trained with him and then came and started teaching non-duality. And you and I were trained by Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, who was essentially an Advaita Vedantist. But some of the teachers teaching have taken the idea of oneness to an extreme where they kind of deny the reality of relative existence and um, treat it as if it's all a dream and nothing to pay much attention to. And some of them have also gone so far as to say we're already awakened beings. We're already that which we seek. And so, therefore, practices and techniques and methods are just feeding the illusion.
Well,
And
let me ask you about that, Phil, because this is the one area that I think I find most difficult to understand
yeah,
that perspective, because they talk about oneness, okay, and this awakening, and like you were saying, I've heard it said by many. Well, you're already there. You're already enlightened. You're already awake. Eh, so if that's the case, what and it almost as if they're saying you don't have to do anything, then why do they have self-inquiry groups? Why do they seem to have teachers that are expert in this and guides and on and on? If it's already the case that people are awakened, and I know people, if I told them they were fully awakened, they would be very disappointed if they thought this is it. This
that's
is
right. That's right.
throw me in front of a bus if this is as good as it's going to get. So I'm just wondering about that.
I know. And so do most people. And since we're following up here on the interview with John Prendergast, he would not be one of those people who would deny the efficacy of methods and practices and so forth. That's a kind of, excuse me, a kind of extreme. That's, most people would discount. It's nice in theory, and a lot of people claim to have been awakened, and it's a classic thing when people have this enlightenment experience. Even Buddha said, talked about it.
Hmm.
It's like nothing. It was always present. We just aren't awakened to that reality. So they have satsangs and gatherings and methods to help people snap out of the ignorance and realize what's already the total reality.
Hmm.
But so are the methods like meditation. Even Ramana Maharshi, the great non-dualist who everybody reveres, he was very happy if people needed to meditate and had practices, even devotional practices, where there's an object of devotion that's obviously separate from the devotee, at least in perception. And so that kind of extreme, I think we can discount.
Right.
Right. And John would not have, and I think he mentioned in our interview that he's not in that school of
He
thought.
seemed very practical, and that may come from his psychotherapeutic training. This is, by the way, Dennis Ramundi and Phil Goldberg. We're discussing contemporary spirituality. Our website, www.spiritmatterstalk.com. Please subscribe. It's free to subscribe to our podcast, and we'll be sending you more information if you do so. Phil, in regard to the psychotherapeutic end of things and spirituality, John obviously is not the only person doing this. We've spoken to others that also bring spirituality and technologies of spirituality into psychotherapy. How familiar are you with that? I've never been to a psychotherapist that had that type of background, but I think it is and could be and should be a wonderful adjunct, and I'm sure it's much more commonly practiced and accepted now than it was, 30 years ago. But
Yes.
uh, is there a big range in regard to how uh, into different spiritual technologies and whatnot these psychotherapists get into?
Yeah, and you're right. It's a very different world now than it was 30 years ago, even more so 40
Hmm.
and 50 years ago. Um, People like Abraham Maslow and then a whole bunch of other people started to realize there was a dimension of spirituality that had been ignored by psychology. They just sort of wrote it off as fantasy and illusion, the way Freud did anything
Hmm.
remotely, close to religion. And But then in the 60s and 70s, when the methods of Buddhism and Hinduism, when people started meditating, they realized there's a whole dimension of life that had not been accounted for, and that's how humanistic psychology and then transpersonal psychology were invented or created or
Right,
developed.
right.
And
And
out of that, there's a lot of psychotherapists who take spirituality seriously and study the methods and try to integrate, the kind of training they've had as psychotherapists with meditative practices and with a perspective that we're not just, the whole aim of development is not just to be well adjusted egos, but that there's, spiritual development beyond that.
right, and I think if you go way back in the development of theories of personality in modern psychology, Carl Jung, I think definitely had spiritual influences, Vedic
Yes.
influences in what he taught, and in some ways was a way ahead of his time, and built sort of on what Freud did, but brought in the idea of collective consciousness and spirituality. So it's been there, I think, for quite some
Yes.
time. But I think in recent years, going to a psychotherapist and having the psychotherapist say, "Hey, maybe you should start meditation, or maybe you should try this practice or that practice." I think is way, way, way more common than it's ever been, and
Far
becoming
more
even more
common.
so.
Now, and what's interesting is now there are psychotherapists that have a deep spiritual orientation about who we are and what we are as human beings. And John Prendergast would be one of them.
Hmm.
He has a long background in studying with, spiritual teachers of, great authenticity. and has had his own 40 whatever years of practice. But there are others who would think it's all bull, that their worldview is probably strictly materialistic and ego centered in the sense of understanding what human beings are. But they can't deny the evidence of how good meditation and related practices like hatha
Right.
yoga and pranayama, how much they have helped people and can be used as an adjunct to psychotherapy. So they may see those methods as purely psychophysiological tools to use that may be more efficacious than
Hmm.
medicines or
Right.
pharmaceuticals and can help people, but they don't necessarily have, they're not the ones to go to if you have questions about your spiritual life,
Right.
whereas
So
somebody like John would be.
fascinating stuff. And we'll be getting more into this. I hope we have John back on the show, but certainly other people with spiritual backgrounds who also have backgrounds in clinical psychology and
Yeah.
discussing that. This is Dennis Ramundi and Phil Goldberg, author of American Veda, our podcast. Um, spiritmatterstalk.com. And please subscribe if you go to our website, www.spiritmatterstalk.com. That information will be there and it's free to subscribe.
Great, Dennis.
All right. We will back on the air again soon.
Okay.